Welcome to Decision Space, the only podcast that takes place right here between the turns in your favorite game. I'm Jake.
And I'm Brendan.
And today we are talking about a very special game, a huge game. Actually, it's a pretty small game. It's Hey, That's My Fish. And we're dedicating a whole episode to this very light, very fun kind of family game. And I can't wait to talk about it.
Yeah, a huge game in the moments that you might remember after playing it. Though a pretty small table space, 60 tiles, few penguin pieces, and a lot of fun. How are you doing this week, Jake?
I am doing great. I have my laptop back, so hopefully you'll hear some nice sound effects in this episode. Sorry about last week. So just a small hiccup because I left my computer in Kansas, which is tough to edit a podcast on when you are sitting in St. Louis.
It's tough to manage your avid podcasting career when you have your pro kickball career happening simultaneously.
Yeah, that is very true. I've talked a lot about playing disc golf on this podcast, but I'm also very passionate about playing the game for little kids that is Kickball, and actually have had cause to travel the 4.5 hour drive to Kansas to play in a few important games lately, including this past week, which gave me the opportunity to pick up my laptop and bring us back here. So it's pretty insane. It's pretty
kickball.
Insane.
It's not like backyard kickball with like 6 people on each team. It's like full teams and like 100 people spectating, 200 people spectating.
So the way the league works is there's 36 teams and all the games take place on Sunday in Lawrence, Kansas. And all the games start at either a 5 p.m. or a 7 p.m. start time, with the exception of the game of the week, which is sort of the whatever matchup is determined to be the most fun or competitive for spectators that week. And that one starts at 9:15. So traditionally, all the other teams kind of come flooding into the stadium, and get anywhere from really 300 to 500 spectators, and it's a complete blast. So my team, longtime team, I've been a member of the Love Garden Squids for, I believe this is my 8th season on the Squids and 9th season overall in the league. So we were picked for the game of the week, and it was I'm just a little too close here in St. Louis to talk myself out of making the drive to play under the lights.
4.5 hours is a commitment, I will say. So the passion's clearly there.
Yeah, but we won the game. It was super competitive, a comeback victory. I kicked in a base clearing triple to kind of get us back into the game. So all said and done, well worth it. I'm so glad I went.
So amazing. I'm also just so impressed. We were talking a little bit before the show about your base clearing triple, and the fact that you were able to, off like an on the ground kick to shortstop, convert into a triple. That's like such an exciting moment. I feel like, Jake, this is a topic we could just go on and on about because we clearly love talking about sports here. But I'm curious, for any listeners out there, if you'd be interested in hearing a sports episode, let us know that the appetite is there. You don't just want the metaphors constantly dripping through the seams of every show. You want an entire show dedicated.
I think we're definitely going to do that, whether listeners like it or not. And I'm actually in the back of my head, I know there in the near future, it's very likely that you will be missing in action for a few episodes. And one of the episodes I'm planning to do then will be maybe even a mini series of gateway sports episodes. So, people talk a lot about gateway board games in the hobby. And so I want to talk a little bit about some kind of gateway sports that people who are board gamers, but maybe not as experienced in recreational sports, might really enjoy playing. So I want to do a dedicated kickball episode with some of my good friends from this league I'm talking about, and then I think I need to run it by my friends here, but I'd love to do a gateway sports episode on disc golf with Paul and Jamie, my disc golf buddies here in St. Louis. And I think I think there's a lot of crossover, and those would be some really fun episodes to put together.
Yeah, games are games with
That's right.
interesting decisions. I can't wait. And even though you heard it here first, folks, Jake is benching me. He's sending me away. No, it's actually, fraternity leave stuff. But I'm really excited. It'll be fun to be a listener for a few episodes of Decision Space as well. That won't be for, well, who knows? Babies sometimes make their own plans, but that won't be for at least a couple months still. So a hearty handful of episodes to dive into first.
With that initial banter, people are here because they want to hear about, hey, that's my fish. Last thing, well, just for our pre-planners out there, you're already well aware, but next week will be a What We Talk About episode. I don't think we have a topic ironed out yet. Maybe we'll do sports. Maybe we'll do something else, but those are always super fun. So look forward to that. And now, without further ado, Brendan, let's get into our ratings and slogans for Hey, That's My Fish.
Hey, That's My Fish is a highly interactive romp that plays out in just a handful of minutes. Like a snow cone, it packs a flavorful punch up front, despite maybe being a little one note as an experience overall. Regardless, just like a snow cone, I'll always be happy to return to a game of Hey, That's My Fish when the day calls for refreshing reprieve and enjoy the treat melting away before me. 8.5 out of 10.
Wow, that's a high rating. That's a little higher than I expected. That's wonderful.
This game's brilliant.
It's such a good game. Yeah. So I think for me, Hey, That's My Fish is an excellent example of a game that just is reduced down to the core of an idea, but without really reducing the strategy and tactics at play. So it's such a simple and wonderful little nugget. It's essentially, I'll talk more about it. What I feel like this game is really like it's a bunch of iterative games of chicken going on, all at the same time between multiple parties, which is a very, very fun experience to be a part of. I'm going to give it a 7 out of 10. It's a wonderful game. I think it's great, and I'll play it anytime it's brought up.
Awesome. It'll be interesting to see too if we return to Turbulence then for the first time in a few episodes, since we haven't sort of had Turbulence with some of our most recent games. But it sounds like we might be able to find a few things. So I guess is now a good time, Jake, I guess we should talk about the designer. So the game is designed by Gunter Cornet, who you might know also as the designer of Kahuna. That's a Cosmos 2-player game. And also notably the Bottle Imp, which comes highly recommended from some friends in our Discord. And also it's co-designed with Alvidas Jakliunas. And Hey, That's My Fish is his most common or his most well-known title. Apologies if I butchered your name. I'm sorry. Hey, That's My Fish was first published in 2003, and it plays 2 to 4 players. We'll get into this a little bit, but it's answers the problem of scaling in a pretty interesting way. And I thought its tagline was really cute, so I included it here. That's quest for the most fish, but don't get stranded as ice disappears beneath your feet. It's like very succinct and punchy.
That's right. Just like this game, succinct and punchy. Have you played Kahuna or the Bottle Imp?
I haven't. I've meant to play Kahuna for a long time, and now the Bottle Imp has come recommended from like 2 totally separate groups of people. So it's definitely one I need to get at the table. How about you, Jake?
I haven't, but I'd be interested. I think Kahuna's on Yukata, so maybe it's one we should check out for a future episode or just to play for fun. I'd love to check it out.
It's in the Cosmos 2-player series, which Lost Cities is also in. So I feel like all of those games, it just piques my interest. I'm like, ooh, good 2-player games.
Interdecisional Spaceship. We're going to need you to play the audio for Hey, That's My Fish rules overview. Beep, boop, boop, boop.
Hey, That's My Fish is a highly interactive, abstract movement game for 2 to 4 players. In Hey, That's My Fish, players compete to collect the most fish from ice floats represented by hexagonal tiles showing 1, 2, or 3 fish on them. To do this, players move one of their penguin pieces as far as they'd like in a straight line without going off the board, hitting another player's penguin, or crossing an empty space. Then, That player collects the tile they moved from, leaving an empty space in the game board. Play continues like this clockwise around the table as each turn one tile is removed and the play space wanes until no valid moves remain, at which point the game ends and players count up all the fish on tiles they've collected. The player who's collected the most fish wins. Depending on player count, players will control 2, 3, or 4 penguins on the game board, but the same 60 tiles, 30 tiles depicting a single fish, 20 tiles depicting 2 fish, and 10 tiles depicting 3 fish are randomly arranged into a square to start the game. This gives the game a variable play space, so no two games feel exactly alike. To start the game, players take turns adding one of their penguins to the board and may only add their penguins to tiles showing a single fish. That's everything you need to know about this brutal little tile game, Hey, That's My Fish.
Thank you, Brendan, for that wonderful rules overview for Hey, That's My Fish. Hopefully that gives people a good idea of how to play this very simple game. And let's jump right in. We're here in our spaceship. We're looking around. Let's explore the character and characterize the decision space for this light game.
Type, waning, period, end of discussion. It's literally a game built on the concept of waning. As every turn, you are removing one tile from the play space. And interestingly, I think we'll get into this too, Jake, but you're removing one tile, but by placing your penguin on another tile, you're removing another tile from the potential spaces your opponents can occupy, which I think is also very interesting and sort of a... you don't take it off the board, you're going to claim it, but that sort of like delayed claiming of the fish, you're really every turn sort of, you've permanently removed the one you leave and you're permanently removing the one you move to. You just aren't pulling it off the board yet. And that's an interesting sort of first level heuristic that as a player you have to get over. The feel, the penguin on the box, there's this, the cover, at least the Fantasy Flight Games cover, has a penguin in the background just like clutching his flippers, wings, and looking towards the sky, like cursing. And that's the feel of the game most of the time. Like, oh my gosh, you scoundrel, those are my fish.
Yeah, we talked a little bit about this beforehand, but the name of the game is, it's pretty unique, right?
Yeah.
You don't get very often board games named that are literally like an exclamation of the table talk. But, I had this idea that perhaps they had this game prototype going at a playtest session and somebody kind of called out of the table like, "Hey, that's my fish." And the person sitting there taking notes was like, "That's the title."
Totally. It'd be like if the Resistance was called You're the Traitor, or if like Catan was called Two Sheep for a Brick.
2 sheep for a brick. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. What do you think of the size of this decision?
Goddamn sheep, Brian.
But it just works so well. It gets you right in the headspace of like, oh, it's okay to be mean in this game. It's the point.
It is, yeah, and I feel like it does a good job too of not only giving people permission to be mean, in a way that, in a other family games perhaps might turn people off. Like, this is like, hey, this is what this game is. It's mean. And it also sort of sets the stage of like, let's have some fun table talk here.
Totally.
In a way that, if this game was just called like Ice Flows or something like that, it's such a tactical and strategic experience at the core, that, and even playing it sometimes as is, it can be a really quiet game where people are just like hunched over the table, looking at the board, calculating, playing the moves. So I think just like the lightheartedness of the name, but also the art that you're talking about, and the even the little tiny penguin sculpts, at least in my edition of the game, are like, which is I think the most recent really small box version. The penguins are so emotive, right? Like they're like crying out in frustration or like carrying a sack of fish or I don't know, racing around, that it really does liven up the game in an important way, that I think does make that feel feel more like lighthearted
Mm.
than the game itself actually is.
Yeah, and it's important to note that part of the reason why the game works is because it's so quick. The decision space wanes so quickly that it never feels that bad that you made a critical error stranding yourself on a two float island in the second turn of the game because people have like socked you into a corner because you'll play again, and that's great. That's like what these games kind of do. What do you think of the size of the decision space, Jake? You're making the same decision over and over. There's one decision in the game. Where do you want to move your penguins? But in terms of the actual size, especially at the outset, like where does it compare? Or like, it's so hard with abstract games.
You know, I think that like one of the things that's really fun about this game is like, you're absolutely right. This is clearly a waning game. It's almost like a definitive version of that.
Yeah.
But the pace at which it wanes down to nothing from really at the beginning, I think your decision space is huge.
Yeah.
I mean, you're like when you're placing your fish out, I don't know exactly how many you have to place your penguin on a one fish space. So
there's 30.
There's 30. All right, so there's 30 different spaces, and it's really difficult to say that any of them aren't viable at the start of the game. And you also want to factor in, like what your opponents might do and like where your subsequent placements might be. That is a quite big space. It might not play out as like this huge stinky thing in practice as much because even if there's a ton of viable spaces, like the difference between them might not always be super great. So players don't necessarily need to take a whole long time evaluating each and every one. Just some really quick heuristics can kind of get you into a good spot pretty quickly. But I do think that decision space is there, and perhaps even bigger than that initial placement. When you're taking your first turn and you've got 3 penguins on the board, which can most closely be associated with, a queen in chess, right? They can go as far as you want in any direction. So you're essentially looking at this chessboard, and you've got 3 queens in the middle of it that can go anywhere. And the first move you're going to make is going to have huge repercussions that are going to just ripple throughout the whole rest of the game, that I feel like the decision space really opens up into, I don't know. I don't know what our number scale was, but honestly, like closer to the higher end of that than the bottom.
Yeah, that's really interesting. The number scale you're talking about, when in our first handful of episodes, we tried to rate the size of decision spaces, I think on a scale of 0 to 100, which ended up not being our most useful lens. But I would agree, especially early on, the decision space feels huge in terms of viable decisions. And interestingly, the board wanes down linearly. Every turn, a tile is going to get removed, every player's turn. But the decision space, I feel like, wanes much more quickly than that in terms of the viable. You still have a lot of choices, but your actual decisions that you can choose between, right? Those viable choices that push you closer to victory, I think shrink pretty quickly. But what really intrigues me is, so the variability of the board is a key aspect of this game, I think. And I talked about it some in the rules overview, but basically no 2 boards are ever going to be exactly the same because there's the 30 single fish tiles, the 22 fish tiles, and the 10 3-fish tiles that are randomly arranged in roughly the shape of a square. And I feel like one thing that's so interesting about Hey, That's My Fish is it's very difficult to evaluate the effectiveness of a move on a given turn early in the game, because so much of the value of a potential play has to do with the plays your opponents take. And And it's hard to tell even what an optimal move is in that instance, because your optimal moves depend on the moves your opponents take. So, and you have to sort of think, okay, especially when it's sort of maybe a third of the ice floats are gone, you're really thinking and you're trying to get inside the other player's head to some extent of, are they going to sort of move down here and try to carve out this part of the board, or are they going to move up here, and what will they do? And you very quickly end up in that sort of donkey space area, the term that we've gone back to, which I think could make a great what we talk about episode at some point. I've been tracing the etymology of it a little bit, trying to sort of figure out how I came to learn that term and have locked it down. But I'll save it in case we get to we actually do an episode on it. But again, the idea of, I think that Jake's going to do X, so I'm going to do Y to counter X, but then Jake might do C or Z.
Right. Yeah, and I'm totally with you, and I think like what I was talking about in my sort of slogan or whatever, which was sort of rambling and not really coherent. When I'm talking about like an iterative game of chicken, very often when you're competing with an opponent for territory in Hey, That's My Fish, whoever makes the first move into that area is often the one that gets on the losing end. Like if you race to the bottom first and I go there second, it's really easy to position the penguin in a way that, you know, you're cutting off your opponent on that side of the board. So a lot of the game ends up being, you know, even though you can move your penguin all the way, you know, across the board if you want to, a lot of the time it's these games of two penguins moving like one space closer to each other, like one at a time, and not wanting to be the first one to actually like take that gamble, because you're giving up access to the rest of the board. So figuring out when it's like, okay, I'm gonna put myself in a position that cuts me off because it's gonna give me, you know, the exclusive ability to collect these 3 valuable fish tiles. You know, determining like when in the game it's worth it to essentially take that one penguin out of commission for the rest of the game is a huge and it's really an important decision point and a really interesting one.
Yeah, I feel like I want to sort of touch on what you just said, Jake, because I think it's so essential to how I experience learning the game, which I first came across this game in maybe 2013 or 2014, maybe slightly later, 2014, 2015 maybe. And upon reading the rulebook and setting it up, I did the thing that I feel like most Hey, That's My Fish players do, which is like, okay, I'm going to move completely across the board on my first move. And it's going to be this game of completely sweeping moves where we're racing across the entire board. And then you sort of quickly realize that being able to be next to the ice float that you just cleared is also quite powerful, because then you have sort of this two hole gap that you're sort of holding down. But the flip side of that is when you're playing a game where people are playing more passively, taking this small moves because they can be so powerful to sort of chip away and carve out ice floats where you can control them completely. When you find that one move that is completely zipping across the board and puts you in a very powerful position, you can completely potentially surprise your opponents as they're sort of not looking for it. And it's this like very exciting, cool moment where you like sweep in and like, you know, like smile at the camera almost and are like, hey, that's my fish though. And I sort of love that about the game. There's lots of because it's so hard to potentially actually evaluate moves. I think there is room for surprise, even when the game can get to a point where it feels like the moves are quite obvious.
Absolutely. And I mean, this is an abstract game in kind of the best way, in that, like, let's see, I don't want to phrase this. Like chess, you know, a game we often go back to, a helpful example is like, yeah, your objective is to take your opponent's king off the board. That's how you win the game. But really, it's a game of territory control. Like, in order to win, you want to create such an advantageous board state that you are able to effectively create checkmate. And I think, Hey, That's My Fish works in such a similar way. Like, yes, like the end goal of the game is to collect the most valuable fish. But in order to do that, you're really playing a game of territory control. And when you get past that level 1 of you're like, yeah, I'm just gonna like zip over here to get this 3 tile, and start thinking more in terms of how am I using my 3 penguins on the board to like wall off certain areas, just like a game of chess, surprise my opponent by slipping past the defenses in an unsuspecting or surprising way, or even like fork your opponent by putting your penguin in such a way that no matter what they choose next, you're able to like block them off, or you're able to like get resources that they thought were theirs alone. The game really opens up in a surprising way for a game that presents as, a game that takes 1 minute to learn, and has colorful, emotive penguin skulls.
Yeah, this might be the first game that I feel like I was able to teach completely in the rules overview, which was very fun, and keep it under 2 minutes still. Forking is so interesting. When you have that first moment of forking another player, you're like, oh, this is good. It feels great. Like you have no decisions here, only choices. It's an excellent moment. And I think one thing that's so interesting about the chess comparison to me too, Jake, is I think playing chess and then coming to this, in chess, you sort of appreciate that your pieces can support each other. And here, right, so like not in both games, not moving a piece can be very powerful. But in chess, it's the threat of the piece being able to take another piece, preventing your opponent from moving that. But I feel like in Hey, That's My Fish, because your piece is only as powerful as the things it's claimed or the tile it's on. And the tension is really in that there's so many areas of every turn you want to move all your penguins, but you can only move one of them. And that's where the tough decision ultimately is in a lot of turns of, do I need to focus on my penguin in this upper left-hand corner who's slowly being closed off, or the penguin in the lower right-hand corner where if I don't take this turn, I might miss out on these fish, but it depends on what the third player is going to do. And that to me is one of the most interesting spaces, because you can't gain on tempo. You just take your turn, and then that was your turn, and you're going to want to move everything, and you can't. And that's where you have to figure out where to take the risks.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. And your penguins can be too, can serve different roles. Like you might have one in your early placement. You're like, wow, this is a good spot. Like I have access to a lot of valuable tiles. So maybe use your next penguin placement to just block.
Yeah.
Right. Like even though it theoretically, at a level 1 understanding of the game, it doesn't make a lot of sense to put 2 of your penguins right next to each other on the board, because that's going to be isolating you kind of away from a majority of the time, right? You're closing off your options. But if you can, placing that penguin there, blocks another person's access to those tiles, like you're actually saving yourself, movements throughout the game, in order to cut people off that, might be well worth that kind of sacrifice of access to the rest of the board.
Yeah, the ability to coordinate your penguins is such an interesting aspect of the game too. And so at 2 players, you have 4 penguins. At 3 players, you have 3 penguins. And at 4 players, you have 2 penguins, which really changes sort of the dynamic and feel of the game in a lot of ways, I think, and sort of the decision space available to you and how much you're sort of coordinating your penguins versus trying to figure out what your opponents are doing, in terms of working off the moves you think they're going to make. It's maybe we can sort of settle in and talk about what you just mentioned though, Jake, the initial placements of the game, because that's such like a rich decision space where whole games can almost be decided if played wrong at the outset of Hey, That's My Fish.
Yeah, I do think that is true. It reminds me a lot of like Catan, where it's hard you can't win the game on your initial placements, but you can put yourself in such a bad position that you essentially can't win.
Yeah.
You can lose it. So I mean, that is something that, maybe one like little element of turbulence, a small one there. I don't particularly love that, especially because I don't know. Especially because sometimes it can be like you can place in a great spot, and say you're playing in a 4-player game, and then like the next three people just like surround you completely. It's like, well, gee, that really sucks.
Yeah, just get dogpiled on completely.
Yeah. And
Totally.
maybe, that's something you could think about ahead of time. You could say, like, hey, this is where all the three fish tiles are. This is such a valuable spot on the board. If I go there, am I opening myself up to get cut off? You know. So there is theoretically like an ability to outthink, but that's pretty tough to be like, I'm going to give up this lucrative space because I think somebody else will come in and cut me off later. It's just tough. And for new players, it could be like, oh, I get this game. What a slam dunk this is. And then there's like, oh, okay, well, now I'm done.
I picked this game up with a friend to play on Yukata over the weekend. And I sort of mentioned to them, I was like, the first game is going to be rough, but just commit to playing a second one because you're going to enjoy it way more. And we got maybe a third of the way through the turns and they were like, let's just start the second game. Like, I see everything I did wrong and it would be more fun to take the mistakes I've learned here already and just go to the next one. And it was. And I think it's really interesting how, Hey, That's My Fish is a game where after one play, your ability to see the decision space and to see how the game plays out just so rapidly shifts. You only need 5 turns and you're like, oh, okay, I understand. And then you're off to the races. But the learning curve that happens in those first 5 turns, yeah, it lets you jump off a cliff or isolate yourself on a ice flow of 2 fish.
Yeah, I had a really similar experience with some of my friends I was playing on Tabletop Simulator, and these are guys I played a lot of Catan with in college, so board game players, but not super big hobbyists. And we tried out Hey, That's My Fish after our main game of the evening, and we played the first game, and my buddy Derek kind of, just clicking around, like didn't seem to really grasp it at all. I don't remember, but I don't think he did particularly well. We decided to go round 2, and Derek, makes we all place our penguins, and Derek is playing first, and he's about to move, and he's like, hold on. And we're like, come on, just go. He's like, but this changes everything.
That's so awesome.
I was like, okay, he's got it. Now we're playing Hey, That's My Fish.
It is really interesting, Jake, how the game you can have, you mentioned this, such quiet turns and then such explosive turns on the other end of it, right? And that's that tension of like every move I make matters so much. And I think that comes out of the potential to make the mistakes because it's easier to make a bad move in the game than it is to make an amazing move.
Yeah, absolutely. It's like such a crazy game in the sense that, like, we talked about how it's waning. And I don't want to use the word dynamic, but each move changes so much about the game state that they always feel big, even the small moves, because it's such a game of tempo and placement. That every move is going to ripple throughout the game. That even small moves are big, even if it doesn't feel like that at the time. So much so that, right, we talked about how that your first move is going to be a huge decision space, but by the time it gets back to you, especially if you're playing, well, even if you're only playing with a 2-player game, based on what your opponent does, that might reduce the decision space from like approaching, hundreds of viable movements or something to like, oh, well, now I have to move here because of what they've done.
Totally.
It can shrink that fast.
Something that has to be responded to completely.
Right. If I don't move, then I lose my queen.
Yeah. No, definitely. And I feel like partially the one thing that's so interesting about the game is the way in which you can make large ice floats all your own through clever movement, where you can potentially claim really large swaths of fish by carving out the ice, and that nothing in the rules says you can do this, right? It's just this emergent thing that happens based on the ice melting. And I think we'd be remiss not to talk about that to some extent, because I think that those moments can be some of the most feel-good moments in the game. And partially it's because it's a game of so much uncertainty where at that moment, when you've secured an ice float, everything becomes certain and you know how it's going to play out. And you have lots of easy choices because you're going to claim every single little one and you get to count up all your fish. And it's just the potential in this game for that to happen for me is part of why this game is such a win for me, is I think those moments, they just feel great. Yeah.
We talk about bingos a lot in games, and securing like a significant ice flow to yourself, you know, oftentimes feels like a bingo in the best way. I totally agree. I've come to the end of the game and I'm looking at my board and I'm like, oh, you guys left me all of Greenland. That was nice. Like, thank you so much. And it just feel like, and if you do that, that's going to be a win. So it just feels like such a great moment. And it also enables some of the best moments of tension in the game, because you're, flipping between, as I was talking about at the beginning, you're constantly flipping and evaluating between like claiming island, all to yourself to secure all these points. That's going to be really good, and trying to cut your opponent off, right?
Yeah.
So, there are times in the game where, you make a move to cut somebody off, but that might actually be opening a path for them to, make a move that's going to allow them to claim an area to their own, and sort of like deciding like, okay, when is somebody like getting cut off that's bad, and when are we just like gifting somebody a whole bunch of fish to their own, and trying to like, navigate those situations. There's a lot of tension there.
Definitely. And the random placement of the board and the 3 different values of fish do so much good in creating moments like this, because I feel like early on there's this tension between I really need to carve out space, but if I can pick up a few 3s on the way, that feels important too. There's only 10 on the board and they're 3 times as valuable as the single fish tiles. So securing at least some of those in your pursuit of carving out territory feels quite important. Though sometimes the better move is to, move to a single or a double and set up the larger ice flow if you can, or take the risk of doing that, hoping that it will play out in the way that you think it might. And I think that to me is part of the brilliance of the design, is there's not that many elements in the game. There's tiles, there's your markers, and there's the value of the fish. And that combined with the movement rules just creates so much crunch in terms of variability too, and difficulty to assess those things. Like if the board was always the same every single time, I think it would be very easy to evaluate things after you had played enough. And the brilliance is just hiding the evaluations enough that as humans, it's always sort of foggy.
Yeah. And I think that's also where this game is a very, we talk about strategy versus tactics a lot, and this game is obviously like very tactical.
Yeah.
But I do think that in that decision that you point out between like, do I claim this 3 fish tile for the points, or do I, give up value with this movement because it's going to create more value later in the game by, helping me secure like a larger quantity of tiles, which will ultimately be more points overall, is really a strategic decision in a lot of ways. And I think I'm curious what you think about this, but I do think that there are almost like 2 different viable paths to victory in this game that you could go for. One being like trying to claim space. At the beginning of the game, you can be like, I'm just focusing on, sectioning off the board in such a way that I'm claiming as much space as possible. But if you do that, you might lose to somebody who's just saying like, okay, well, if you're doing that, I don't really care if you get, twice as many tiles as me, because like all the tiles I'm getting are going to be the ones worth 3 and 2, so at the end of the game, my tiles are 2.5x value of yours, even though you have twice as many tiles as me.
Yeah, it's really interesting because I feel like both strategies can end up converging in some ways. Mm-hmm. Though there's definitely I think on playing a bunch in person and then playing on Yukata a lot, there's definitely the person who they go into the game and they say, I'm only going to take small moves. I'm going to ignore the 3 value fish. And my whole goal is carving out large flows for the most part. And then yeah, I think in that way, the most basic strategy of like both these strategies lead in the same direction in some ways, because by carving out an ice flow, you're trying to carve out one where that's going to have twos and maybe even a three, and a bunch of ones. That's just
But
the
there's
way
going
it's
to
going to
be
work
but there's going to be a lot of people competing
for
for
that.
those if it, you know what I mean? Like
Yeah,
if there's a bunch of 3 tiles over there, like good, yeah, like that would be
they'll slide
great to
in.
carve it off by yourself, but probably people aren't going to let you have that.
Totally. And then because there's the other people who are going in and saying, okay, I'll just snag all the threes and twos I can early on, and then I'll sort out the end game. It'll become clear how to make that work. And I think, yeah, I love that about the game. I think that it's 2 strategic paths that lead ultimately to that same destination, but
Right.
in an interesting way.
Yeah, it is probably going to come down to in many cases what I've seen in our games is that it'll kind of come down to how well the person making the playing that area control game, like trying to claim the most tiles, is able to execute
Yeah.
throughout the game. Because you come to an end game where, you know, if I'm the one going for the high value tiles and we get to the end game and, you know, you haven't been able to create a game state in such a way that I have no options and I'm able just to slide even one penguin into a space that you don't want to be, then that's probably, you know, all she wrote. So I find myself, yeah, I feel like in my plays, I find myself more going for like the high value
Mm.
tiles early in the game, and I'm rarely the one who ends the game with the most tiles unless something's gone horribly awry for my opponents. And I feel like that puts like more pressure. Like I think it's like it demands more execution of you if you're trying to like play that territory control game perfectly.
I feel like this is fitting into the paradigm in which we approach games often, which is that you like your path, the optimal path through the game is this: every turn you want to just get as many sure bet points as you can. And I play games where I want to see how I can take interesting risks to have really high payout that would secure victory. Because I started off going for lots of threes, but now strategically, I feel like whenever I sit down to play this game, I'm like, I just want to get the biggest ice float I possibly can. I want to sit there and smile as I collect every individual tile and make smart bets. And the reason they feel like bets really is because it's impossible to see the consequences of your decisions outside of their immediate consequences, because your decisions, the consequences of them, are wholly dependent on your opponents, and what they end up doing. So that's why they feel like bets. And I love that about the game. But that's definitely the 2 sort of different ways that we approach it, I think.
Yeah, no,
Like
that
most games.
makes a lot of sense. And yeah,
Yeah.
we've been playing a lot with in 3-player games with Indoor from our Discord, and he's been whipping up on us using.
Oh my
It
gosh.
seems like primarily their
Area
strategy
control.
is to go for the area control,
Yep.
and are very frequently executing it perfectly. To where we get to the end of the game state, and I'll be like tied and lose the tie break, which is having the most tiles claim. You
Yeah.
know, or I'll be 1 point behind or something like that. You know.
And I think a big part of that too is the way that Ender plays the game, and what they've shown me is the one way in which the strategy of territorial control, in which you can make it, you have potential to amplify the power of your penguins by them being closer to each other, because you're locking down more spaces in close proximity, which is shutting down actions potentially in angles that your opponents get in. Whereas sometimes if you take the strategy of trying to lock down a bunch of high value tiles initially and then sort things out, you're spreading yourself out more and overextending to get there. So it can be more difficult. And I don't know that we've said this explicitly yet, but one thing that's awesome about Hey, That's My Fish is sometimes not moving a penguin, quite literally, can be just as powerful as moving it. And you can exert a lot of pressure on the board just by leaving a penguin in the initial place that you've placed it, and then working around it throughout the game with the decisions you make until the right moment where you sort of cut everything off with a move that you've set up.
Right. The best place, you know, the best positioning in the game would be having a penguin on the board that can do 2 equally powerful things.
Yeah.
And you're forcing your opponent to choose first, because that's them giving up tempo when you're quite literally are in a position where you don't care. You're like, I can go this way or I can go this way. Why don't you waste your time moving that direction, because once they have committed to one direction, right, this gets back to the game of chicken. Well, I still don't have to move my fish because now I just know you're not going that way, so I can just continue to focus somewhere else on the board. And I feel like that is a way, at more expert level, or whatever you want to call it, more advanced level, that value and efficiency is earned in the game.
Yeah. One thing I'm curious about your thoughts on this, Jake. So I talked about Donkey Space a little bit at the beginning. And I think the reason why I keep coming back to it is because in some ways, Donkey Space presumes that there's no optimal way to play a game, right? I know that and my decision is impacted by your decision. So even in like rock, paper, scissors, I guess there is an optimal way to play that game where you just randomly choose a third of the time, unless your opponent has exploitable behavior, which becomes the interesting aspect of games built around Donkey Space, is if you have inconsistent patterns to base around. And I feel like there's sort of different depths of games, and how Donkey is the Donkey Space in some ways, right? Like in rock, paper, scissors, there's definitely Donkey Space, but if both players are playing optimally, truly picking each option a third of the time, and they don't have any exploitable habits, there's not that much donkeyness in it in a way.
Yeah.
But here, wait, can I say it just really quickly? But here, it's the valuations are so dependent on your opponent's choices on their turn and how it will play out that to me, it feels like so far, like it's so much donkey. It's just like all Donkey Space. But because it's that, it kind of fades away in some ways, and you can only think about your choices at times.
Yeah. I mean, I'm kind of struggling with this because, like, for me, if you want to talk about like game theory, like the game that makes more sense is chicken, right? Where two players both want the same thing and are taking like equal steps to get it until somebody is forced to change. And the reason I think that makes more sense than Donkey Space is because like it's very easy, or maybe not like super easy, but like much easier than something in like rock, paper, scissors, because I can look at the board and I pretty much know what my opponents want to do. And so I think you can really, use that when you're making your decisions, to where the game becomes a lot less about even like predicting what your opponent wants to do, and it becomes like forcing your opponent's behavior to change in a specific way through the implication of even a small movement.
Do you feel like there's an inflection point then in every game of Hey, That's My Fish where your opponents, what they want becomes clear to you? Because I feel like early in the game, it's almost impossible to know for sure in some ways. Do you think that's wrong?
I think that makes sense. I do think there's an inflection point, and I think it's less about like knowing what your opponents want to do, and it's more about at a certain point in the game, like your opponent's flexibility to change their path
dwindled.
Is so much smaller than at the beginning of the game, where I would say it's not that it's hard to know what your opponent wants to do even at the beginning of the game. It's just that the game state fluctuates so quickly that what your opponent wants to do fundamentally changes by you moving a penguin into an area. But by the end, it can't fluctuate because they're theoretically locked in.
Yep. Well said.
Yeah.
It's interesting too that this game follows the model we had talked about in our types of decision spaces original episode. Jake, you sort of posited, I wonder if waning decision space games always have to wane to zero. And this is certainly an example of a game built around that idea of like, you literally play the game. First, you play the game until there's until you're out of decisions. And then you play until there's no choices left. And then you finish your last move, where it's literally just one thing you're doing. It's not even an option.
Right.
Yeah,
definitely. What is one other question I wanted to kind of bring up is like, what's your preferred player count for this game? Because I do think it feels really different at all play counts.
One thing that we haven't gotten into is how political the game can potentially feel at a table.
Where I'm going. Yeah.
I really love playing the game at 2 players, but I also enjoy it at 3, and I think I enjoy it at a table with 4 people because I like the table talk and the dynamic. But I think online, I'm less interested in that because a lot of that aspect of the game just kind of fades away. But I really like the sort of 3 penguins, 3 players jockeying for space. And I also like the coordination that you're able to achieve when you have 4 penguins on the board in a 2-player game. How about you?
I haven't played it as much at 2, but I think that's my least favorite
Mm,
because it loses that political aspect that just adds like such an extra layer of richness on top of this game. But a game that already feels like, so much deeper, more strategic and interesting than you would expect.
yeah.
Just in the strategy and tactics. And then you're playing at a full table of 4 players, and the game even has a whole other layer on top of that of like, like I'm saying previously, like the game becomes as much about dictating the moves of your opponent as it does about like where you're actually going yourself. So I would say I actually like it best at 4 players because I think that's where that aspect of the game comes through the best. Where at 3, it's definitely there, but I'm just gonna hit this button because I want to do this. Oh no, I meant to click the button for turbulence and I clicked X to delete it.
Oh no. It's perfect. It's turbulence in our turbulence.
Yeah. So we're gonna do a little bit of.
This is your captain speaking. We are now approaching a little bit of turbulence. Please return to your seats and buckle your safety belts.
All right. Thank you, Captain. So this is our first time using a live soundboard on the podcast, so apologize for that little turbulence to the turbulence. But I did want to talk about like a couple of negative things I have about this game, and one of them is something I've noticed in a lot of our 3-player games, which I think it surprisingly becomes almost like very kingmakery, in that it seems like I've been presented in situations where it's like, okay, well, I literally just get to choose who wins here based on if I move my penguin into Brendan's side of the board or I move my penguin into Inder's side of the board. And different people may resolve that different ways. Like you could say like, hey, like, Brendan, you encroached on my territory. You've been screwing me over this game. So like, I don't want you to win. Or you could just say like, all right, it's my duty, in this magic circle to just play in a way that I can maximize my score, even though either way I'm getting 3rd place. And I mean, I don't think there's like a objectively right way to like answer that question. Different players will interpret that situation differently. I typically tend to just like get my best score no matter what, which can also feel bad because that's like throwing the victory to the person that cost you the win. So anyway, I don't know. Like it does seem like between 3 relatively equally skilled people, quite often the game state does get resolved by that, which is kind of a bummer ending for what has been overall like super fun and satisfying game experiences.
Yeah, I think that that's really fair. And it sort of begs the question of, is it a game that could end sooner in some ways, or would it benefited from that? If the outcomes end up at that point so often, should the games not been designed around a way that it wanes to 0? And I think ultimately it's just so exciting when it works. And I think 3-player that happens more, that's been happening more for us. But part of that too is just like a testament to the fact that somehow the system makes for such close games, which is really interesting when you can potentially claim so much territory. So I guess what I'm saying is I share that turbulence, though the payoff of the excitement of everyone being in the game by the end, for me, I'd rather just have a game end on a low note and then say, okay, let's just play again. It's a 10-minute game than a game that didn't impart the memories that it does.
Yeah, I totally agree. And the other turbulence I wanted to bring up is this is like, I don't know. I don't want to say it's like super small because like it is legitimately drives me insane. But this is the first game that I've ever like bought after playing online, and then I like go to play it in person, and I'm like, oh my god, like the setup The setup is so obnoxious in this game, especially with, and maybe this is not as bad if you have like one of the older editions with like bigger tiles, but you've got these 60 like tiny little cardboard tiles that are like about like the size of a quarter, and you have to like put them in this specific pattern, and it takes literally as long as it does to play the game, which is like 10 minutes in 10 minutes or something, or maybe not, maybe I'm exaggerating slightly, but the first time I played it, I was like, oh my God, like I did not realize like how much work the online implementation is doing by just randomly generating the board and having it set up there.
When I first got the game, Maya and I really enjoyed it, and then we stopped playing it for a long time. And part of the reason was because I think when you're not playing the game, you feel like it takes just as long to set up as it does to play. But I would say after playing it online a bunch, after we decided to go back to it for the podcast, Maya and I've been drawn to playing it more offline again. And like, we've remembered, oh yeah, this is really fun and it's worth it. But it's definitely a game where one person shouldn't be setting it up for everyone else. Everyone who's playing should participate in setting it up for everyone. And then it sort of takes the edge off a little bit.
It takes less time, but it just feels like the setup time versus play time is like a little bit out of whack, which is like for a game that plays so short, it's going to be tougher to balance that. And it's worth it because of the variable play experience. But it is just kind of like, I just wish this wasn't such a tiny game. Like, I feel like the production would have been aided by just like increasing the size of the tile by like, half or something.
Totally. I'm right there with you, Jake. I think a tiny bit larger tile could still be a travel size game that could fit like on the table at a restaurant, but be slightly easier to set up. I feel like the one other thing that we'd be remiss not to mention, though this is another thing where it's sort of like this, just the cost of doing business with this type of abstract game of this weight, is the scoring at the end. Like counting up your tiles, it like takes a little bit of time. There's a little bit of math there. It doesn't bother me. But if I could see it sort of getting at players who want the last move in their games to be definitive. But I like the tension of like, okay, I'm counting. And then everyone waits. And then you sort of break the spell on the magic circle by everyone saying their value at the same time.
Yeah. And I actually like it too, because you put it, you can put them face down when you claim them, right? Of course, if you're playing online, exactly how many tiles, right? How many points everybody has, and it creates a situation because of that where you can like literally, you're 5 or 6 turns in the game, and you're like, okay, well, this is over. Now we're just going through the motions because like this person has, inevitably is getting like X more points. Where if you're playing in person, you don't know that, and that actually might help to resolve some of that kingmaker issue that I've been experiencing so much playing 3 players, right? If you don't know exactly who's winning, then it might be, even if you are making a movement that's ultimately king making, the fact that everyone at the table isn't like explicitly aware that that's happening could dampen it. Because then you're making the actual like decision, like, oh, I think this person's winning, so I should go in that direction.
Sure. Totally. Yeah. Very well put, Jake. I have a question for you.
Okay.
Maybe a closing question. What's the perfect situation for you to play this game in? Like if you, Jake, could play this game in your next play anywhere, what are the circumstances in which you would play it?
So this is a game I got my physical copy of for Christmas, and it's a game I've enjoyed most playing with family and like non-gamers or light gamers. Because I just think it works so well, right? It's instantly understandable. It's like, it's literally more easier to understand and teach than checkers. And, you're up in, the biggest barrier to entry, I think, is the rules teach in so many situations. And this rules teach is like as quick as any game, period. And so I think because of that, like, that to me is like the comparative advantage for this game. Like the reason I love having it in the collection and want to keep playing it is because it has such a small rules overhead. And I think that's why, if I'm playing with a bunch of friends, I might not go to this just because I know I get the opportunity to play it in those other situations. So for me, that is like its purpose in my collection, and it does that job so well.
Yeah, I think that kind of sums up I think that's a great answer as well. I will say my like future perfect setting will be like putting this game in front of like a bunch of 8-year-olds. That's like a long way off for me, but I would love to see like when my friends that do have kids and like our child, I would like to set them all up and like say, go claim fish and just watch them learn to play, because I think that would be a really fun, like it's something that you could grasp really quickly, and watching it play out, I think it would be a fun game to watch kids like learn how to play.
Awesome. Well, I think that is going to do it for this week's episode of Decision Space. Thank you all so much for joining us. Brendan, it's always great talking to you.
Pleasure as always. Take care, Jake.
Exiting the Decision Space. Thanks for listening. Please take care and enjoy the rest of your game.